one thing that I forgot to mention is that in this game currently, if you recall before, as you create a scene, you see that there are two objects that are created, the main camera and the directional light. What I did is I moved my main camera into my capsule or my character game object. So now the main camera is a child object of the character. So it allows me this way to update the camera always follows my character this way, and so that's why I did this. Now, as I mentioned, after adding that line in, we can move forward and backwards, but you can see here that it's too fast. And so one way we can kind of remedy this is we can scale this, right? So we can take this information and then we can scale it by some arbitrary number, which we can kind of set up. So we can say something like private const float scale movement, and I'm just going to pick an arbitrary number, and now I can use scale movement. So this is a constant, so it doesn't change during the execution, of course. Now you'll see that the object is moving much slower. It's still quite fast, but the point is that we're able to control this. Now, this is cool, but we also want to be able to move or rotate our character around, not just move it forward and backwards. So the next thing we want to be able to do is you want to be able to, and actually before that, I want to talk about something with respect to efficiency. And so this get component method, this method is quite expensive. And so one way that you can deal with this is that you can create a variable, call it, let's say, so we want a transform object because we want to avoid calling the get component every single update. So we want to have a transform component that we can basically just get once. So let's say private transform object transform, or player transform rather. So we can say player transform is GameObject.get component transform. Oops. Nope. Okay. So now we can replace this inefficient step with player transform because now we don't need to get this information each time. So now that we have, I just want to make sure as a sanity check that it works. So in Unity, you can very rapidly just start your game instance with the play button. You can pause at any moment, or you can just completely restart by pressing the play button once again once you've started. And just as a sanity check, I'm still able to move, so that's cool. Now, another thing that the transform component allows you to do is access the rotation of the object. And so if we want to get the user's rotation or the user's rotation input, maybe we can use a different axis. So we already have the horizontal axis being used for the input or movement forward and backwards. What we can also do is we can have a variable for the rotation input as well. So now that we have this, we can do a similar thing to before, where we want to get the user's rotation. And so in order to do that, we're going to use a different axis this time. So we're not going to use the vertical axis because it's already being used for the forward and backward movements. So now we're going to get the horizontal axis. And now the question is, we want to be able to create a rotation vector in order to capture or to be able to update the object's rotation. So there's a couple different ways, and there's many different ways to do this, and I'm just going to show you one way to do this. And it's quite a simple way. Essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the following. I'm going to create a variable. So let's call it user rotation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the, actually, there's a different way that we can do this, but I think this should be fine. Yeah. So we can do user rotation is equal to transform dot, actually we can do player transform because we already have the transform, dot rotation, and we want to get the three-dimensional vector describing the XYZ rotations, and so we can get the Euler angles. By default you get quaternions, but we want Euler angles, which are the XYZ angles. And now that we have access to this, the next step is we want to be able to update this rotation. And one way that we can do this is we can take the original rotation that we just got, and we can add it to a new vector, a vector 3. So vector 3 is just a data structure or data type that captures the XYZ or three-dimensional inputs of any sort. So in our case, XYZ is convenient, but it can be any three numbers for any sort of purpose. So a new vector 3, where we're going to not change we're not going to add any X rotation. We're going to add some Y rotation because we want to rotate in the Y axis, because in Unity, if you can see here, let's say I click the player object, you have the green, the red, and the blue. And so the legend here says that green is the y-axis, so we want to rotate around the y-axis. And so we can essentially say, take the user rotation input for the y component, and then we can say 0 for the z component. And now that we have the rotation information, we also need to update that information. So just as before, we have player transform dot position, but now we want to update its rotation. And here we're not going to do a plus equals. We're not going to change we're going to assign the rotation that we've just calculated. And so I'm going to say that the current rotation at this time step is going to be equal to, so the way that the rotation works is that it expects a quaternion, which is a different way of describing rotations. And it's actually a four-dimensional number. And you can look up a lot of mathematical information about this, but the point is that we need to convert our three-dimensional Euler angles into quaternions, and so we can do this simple transform that allows us to do so. So we can take our user rotation, convert it into quaternion, and then we can apply it to the player rotation. Now, let's try to see if, let's see what is our error. Right. So the mistake I made here is that I used a float to describe the rotation, and I talked about it just briefly, that I was going to do a vector 3. So I actually need a vector 3 here to describe the rotation. So now we should be okay. So now if I hit play, as before, I can move forward and backwards. But if I want to rotate, I can move the keys left and right. And now we're able to rotate. Oops. So we're still kind of moving too fast forward and backwards. The rotation seems okay, but yes. Another thing I noticed is that the camera is really close, and so we can move the camera a little further back so we're able to see our character properly. Oops. Okay, let's see if this works. I think this should be reasonable. Yeah, okay, cool. So that's how we write a very simple script that allows us to move our character. And now the advantage, as I mentioned before, is that you can take this move script and apply it to any object in this scene, and we should be able to achieve the same behavior. We can also take our character now and make it into a prefab, and let's say we wanted to have multiple characters in the scene, we could do that.